A fifth two-party system began to form quite rapidly in the early days of Franklin Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. He was sworn in March of 1933, telling Americans the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And within a few days, he had closed the banks to audit their accounts. He had begun switching from the gold standard to a standard based partly on silver and partly on the printing of paper money connected to gold, but not inherently backed by it. Within the first 100 days of his presidency, he created the New Deal, or the first stages of it, what's sometimes called the First New Deal, with banking reform, the Glass-Steagall Act splitting big banks into separate investment and commercial banks, separating the insurance industry from the banks. The FDIC was created to insure bank deposits, so there would be fewer runs on the bank, people trying to get their deposits out before they vanished in a bank failure. The Civil Works Administration, the Public Works Administration, hired people to build public works. The CCC sent young men into the wilderness to build parks, fight forest fires, and do other healthy outdoor work. A number of other programs were created to try to employ people and regulate and improve the economy. A second New Deal in 1935 expanded this with the WPA hiring people of all kinds to create public works, including public art. Historians interviewed former slaves, the famous WPA slave narratives. There were all kinds of research done, interviews of migrant workers. Photographers recorded the Depression in images that are still widely seen today. Roosevelt's second term saw many fewer reforms, but did see the creation of a national minimum wage, 25 cents an hour, in 1938. And during this New Deal, Roosevelt expanded the Democrats' support among all the traditionally Democratic groups. The working class, who had shifted from the Republicans in the late 18 early 1900s. Of course, farmers, especially in the South, almost all Southerners refusing to vote for the party of Lincoln, the Civil War only being over for 70 years at this point. People of recent immigrant descent, or even less recent immigrant descent, particularly Catholics, voted Democratic. But a new group began to vote Democratic as well. As African Americans who, when they could vote at all, had always supported the party of Lincoln, began to look around and ask what the party of Lincoln had done for them lately. The end of slavery was great, but that was a long time ago. Theodore Roosevelt had made sure that African Americans got some government jobs, even in the South, particularly as postmasters, but in other roles too. He had even once had dinner with the reformer, Booker T. Washington. But there was such an outcry against it, he said he would never have dinner with a black man again. And that had been quite a while ago. Whereas the New Deal, although it certainly did not target African Americans, and some places still segregated them into separate CCC camps, separate work camps, did, at least in theory, require African Americans be hired equally with white workers. And because it did help many people who were poor and needed work, and African Americans were unemployed at a rate twice that, the national average, which itself was very high, 25% at its peak. The majority of African Americans felt they benefited from the New Deal and no longer benefited from the Republican Party and switched almost immediately to support the Democratic Party. There were certainly exceptions, and there were many who were not happy that Franklin Roosevelt did not go further. He would not, for example, support dedicated anti-lynching laws, which many people wanted to make sure the federal government would investigate lynchings, ignored by local, especially Southern law enforcement. But Roosevelt couldn't do this, he felt, out of fear of alienating Southern Democrats, whom the Democratic Party depended on. And this New Deal coalition, as it was known, was very successful. The Democrats would control the presidency almost continuously for the rest of the fifth two-party system. They would control the House of Representatives almost continuously till 1994, 60 years or more. They would often control the Senate. And even Republicans, at least as presidential candidates, were chosen from the moderate or even liberal wings of the Republican Party at a time when there were moderate, liberal, and conservative members of both parties. And while Roosevelt pretty effectively held those groups together, the Republicans had more trouble doing so. They again tended to favor their more moderate and liberal members, as that was seen as what the nation wanted, except when given a choice between Franklin Roosevelt and a Republican saying he would pretty much do the same thing Franklin Roosevelt did, but a little bit better and without TVA. The nation chose Franklin Roosevelt over and over, electing him an unprecedented and today unconstitutional 4 times. But until the ratification of the 22nd Amendment, there was no legal limit on how many terms a president could serve. Under Roosevelt, there were 2 other amendments passed. The 20th Amendment moved the inauguration date to January 20th, it being felt 4 months was too long to wait between the election and the inauguration. The 21st Amendment ended nationwide prohibition because some people wanted to drink to relieve the stress of the Depression. It also boosted the economy by reopening all the breweries and distilleries, which in turn helped out producers of grain that was brewed and distilled. Furthermore, to raise tax money, Roosevelt raised the income tax, although he lowered the tariff, as progressives wanted to do. And the New Deal, in many cases, was progressivism on steroids, the belief the government could solve people's problems. Distilled spirits and beer were also taxed by the government. So it was a new source, or rather a return to a very old source of income for the U.S. government. Now, the New Deal coalition was very successful on electing Roosevelt, and after his death, his vice president, Harry Truman, to the presidency for 20 years. Harry Truman, though, upset some members of his own party, although he himself was a Southerner, and in many ways pretty racist. He felt the Constitution was not, and he was horrified, infuriated, fury being one of Truman's primary moods, when African American veterans returning to the South were attacked, beaten up, sometimes even killed. One man was blinded from a police beating, when some Southerners felt that black men wearing a U.S. Army uniform were getting above themselves. And for Truman, this was not an attack on some black guy, which he might not have paid much attention to. Although it's true he had refused to join the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, when the Klan resurged. All that was primarily because they were anti-Catholic, and he had a number of Catholic friends, as well as a Jewish friend, although he never allowed him into his house. And so Truman pushed for federal investigations of civil rights in the South and across the country. He tried to push for, at the time, some pretty significant civil rights legislation, most of which was shot down. But as commander-in-chief, he was able to order the desegregation of the military and the civil service. And the military dragged their feet for some time, but eventually took place. This alienated a number of Southern Democrats, some of whom split off to run a third-party candidate, the States' Rights Party, better known as the Dixiecrats, with Strom Thurmond as their candidate in 1948. On the other hand, Truman's breaking of the railroad strike right after World War II alienated many Union members and other liberal Democrats, some of whom created a new progressive party under Roosevelt's second vice president, Henry Wallace. Despite losing parts of the right and left wing of his own party and being opposed by much of the media, Truman was reelected in 1948 and served out essentially a second term, having fulfilled almost all of Roosevelt's fourth term. But along the way angering most members of his party. And retiring pretty unpopular, but today historians look back pretty positively on his record. He was replaced by Dwight Eisenhower, a pretty moderate Republican who, while he criticized the New Deal, kept almost all its programs in place and himself created a massive public works program, the interstate highways, which were built to promote trade and travel and also to make it possible or much easier to transport military equipment and soldiers around the country in the event of a third world war, which certainly seemed possible during the Cold War. Eisenhower also, at kind of a late and panicked date, um, created NASA to to organize much better America's part in the space race. Eisenhower, of course, was followed by John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, both of whom promised a war on poverty, with Johnson in particular trying to create a great society through massive government spending, and much of it through handouts such as food stamps and other forms of welfare to people who were simply seen as being in need. Whereas Franklin Roosevelt had tried, in most cases, to alleviate the depression through makework programs, feeling it was better for people's work ethic and just sense of personal satisfaction and fulfillment if they were working for the money they received. Um, and there would be some backlash against Lyndon Johnson's big spending on welfare programs, particularly as the economy began to decline in the late 1960s. Although arguably they were successful. The minimum wage reached its highest point ever, $1.60 an hour, during at the end of Lyndon Johnson's second term. And the national poverty level, or pardon me, the rate of people in poverty was nearly halved. Although to be fair, the government can manipulate that a bit by raising or lowering the poverty line if they wish to demonstrate either the success of anti-poverty measures or the need for more of them or the need for fewer. Johnson's popularity also declined as the Vietnam War, which he vastly escalated, seemed to take a turn for the worse, a much worse turn, in 1968 following the Tet Offensive. Although much of that was perception, shaped by a media opposed to the war, as the Tet Offensive, despite its shock and horror in its early stages, was actually militarily a victory for the United States and our allies in the Republic of Vietnam. But the most controversial thing, in some ways, that Johnson would do would support civil rights, despite himself being a Southern Democrat. Um, Dwight Eisenhower had supported civil rights reluctantly but decisively in Little Rock, Arkansas, following the desegregation of Central High School there. But Lyndon Johnson would promote voting rights through the Civil Rights and other rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the 24th Amendment, and other measures. Although there are still those who said he did not go nearly far enough, particularly in his promotion of affirmative action, although he did create that notion. And there were those who said he was not as active in sending, say, the military or federal marshals into the South to really promote integration, as Eisenhower and Kennedy had both done. But in his support for civil rights, Lyndon Johnson alienated many Southerners. And this would mean in 1964, when Johnson was running for a term of his own, having become president after Kennedy's assassination, a number of Southerners voted for the first time voluntarily for the party of Lincoln. The Republican candidate, Barry Goldwater, winning the Deep South, as Southerners were unhappy with Johnson's support for civil rights. Furthermore, Barry Goldwater was very much a conservative Republican, particularly in the libertarian strand of modern conservatism, which in many ways Goldwater defined, saying he wanted to offer a real choice for Americans, not just a watered down, more moderate version of the Democratic policies. as Republicans had seemed to offer ever since the early days of the New Deal. Of course, he lost overwhelmingly, as the Democrats portrayed him as being too fanatical in his opposition to communism, suggesting he would even start a nuclear war. But his candidacy did show many Americans were increasingly unhappy with the more involved, more expensive federal government that developed during the New Deal and the Great Society. And Johnson would begin to lose the South for the Democratic Party at the presidential level. In 1968, Johnson did not run for re-election. And while some Southerners did vote Democratic, and many voted for the third party, American Independent Party, led by the segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace. Some Southerners in 1968 and many in 1962 would support the Republican candidate, who promoted himself very much as a conservative candidate of law and order, appealing to a silent majority of Americans unhappy with the social changes of the 1960s, which, in addition to Lyndon Johnson's welfare and civil rights programs, involved the Supreme Court banning mandatory prayer and Bible readings in the public schools, expanding the rights of accused criminals, making it clear or establishing that they had a right to an attorney, making it clear they had a right to know their rights, the right to remain silent, the right to have an attorney. In the famous case of Miranda versus Arizona. And frankly, Miranda had all he got coming, including his eventual death in a knife fight. But he probably should have been informed of his rights. And many people were unhappy with all these changes and angry at the counterculture of the 1960s and the anti-war movement. Again, turned to a candidate who promised a more conservative approach. Although behind the scenes, he still supported a number of moderate and even what today might be seen as liberal plans. The creation of the EPA, although in those days, environmental protection was not really seen as a partisan issue. And even supporting, to some extent, although never pushing through, nationwide health insurance. Richard Nixon, elected in 1968 and overwhelmingly reelected in the biggest margin ever in the Electoral College in 1972, and promised law and order, a return to traditional American values, and really shifted American political rhetoric in a more conservative direction. So while it can be argued that the New Deal coalition and the fifth two-party system may have lasted until 1980, when Ronald Reagan again won many Southern and other socially conservative Democrats, or even 1994, when many Southern Democrats completely switched to the Republican Party, because most Southerners had still supported the Democrats at the state and local level. I think it's most reasonable to suggest the fifth two-party system and the ideas underlying it shifted to a sixth two-party system around 1968.